A black farmer rescued a man from a crashed car, unaware that he was a billionaire. The morning sun rose slowly over the clay-soaked hills of rural Georgia, casting long, amber shadows over a stretch of land that had endured more than its share of hardship. Elijah Rowe stood at the edge of his cornfield, boots caked with dried mud, eyes squinting against the soft glare as he surveyed rows that once stood proud, now drooping with thirst. The drought had made dust a daily companion, turning fertile soil into brittle earth. Each step he took across the cracked terrain was a quiet confrontation with decline, a confrontation he had faced every day for the past few years. Yet Elijah moved with a stubborn steadiness, shoulders broad and sun-darkened, his hands calloused and worn, evidence of the battle he refused to surrender. The farm, modest in size, stretched just enough to scrape by if the harvests were good and the rains came on time. Neither had happened in a while, but Elijah clung to it like a lifeline. This land wasn't just where he lived, it was the marrow of his family, the place where his grandfather had dug the first furrow with little more than a borrowed mule and a fierce will. Elijah could still remember sitting on the porch as a boy, watching that old man work with quiet dignity, muttering lessons more profound than anything school had taught him. The farm had always been their answer to a world that had tried to deny them ownership, voice, and future. It was where his father had taken his first steps, and now, in cruel symmetry, where he stumbled in confusion as dementia slowly erased the edges of who he used to be. Inside the farmhouse, the air was thick with stillness. Elijah moved through its rooms like a ghost drifting through memory, attending to his father with care and silence. Mornings began with warming water, helping his father into a clean shirt and reminding him of the day's date. Sometimes the old man nodded as if he understood, other times he stared past Elijah as though chasing voices only he could hear. The disease crept in like the drought outside, quiet and unrelenting. Elijah rarely allowed himself time to mourn the version of his father that had vanished. Grief was a luxury he couldn't afford. Outside, the barn's roof sagged in the corners, and the tractor sputtered with age every time Elijah turned the key. He kept it running with the stubborn ingenuity born from necessity, coaxing out more life from machines that should have been retired a decade ago. Bills sat unopened on the kitchen counter, some marked urgent, others final notice. The letters were like vultures circling the edges of his conscience. He tried not to look at them too long, focusing instead on the chores that didn't care how much he owed. The feeding of the chickens, the irrigation pump needing repair, the perimeter fence that kept falling. His only trip to town that week had been a bitter one. Elijah had entered the bank with his head held high, wearing his one pressed shirt and boots wiped clean. He had rehearsed his words, thought through every figure, every answer. The loan extension, he knew, would buy him another season, maybe two if he rationed right. But the manager, a younger man with a plastic smile and rehearsed empathy, had barely looked at the paperwork. He spoke in careful words that danced around the truth, but the message was clear. They weren't interested in saving a dying farm owned by a black man clinging to land no one else wanted. The rejection was signed, stamped, and slid across the desk like an afterthought. As Elijah stepped back out into the sun, his jaw tightened. He passed by the office of a real estate company with a sign taped on the window, "Cash offer for farms, fast closing, no hassle." He knew that company, knew what they were doing, swallowing up black-owned land across the region, parcel by parcel, erasing histories with quick cash and quicker silence. More than once they'd left notes in his mailbox, each one burned in his wood stove before sundown. On his way back, the local deputy pulled up alongside him on a dusty road, feigning concern. Wanted to know if Elijah had the right paperwork for a parcel near the south fence line. Said there had been questions about property boundaries. Elijah knew the game. These weren't real inquiries. They were warnings dressed as conversation. He answered with polite efficiency, eyes steady, knowing any flicker of frustration would only fan the fire. At home, the farm labored on with him. The windmill creaked in protest as it turned, and the once rich soil gave up only meager sprouts. Elijah moved through the days like a soldier with no end to the war, rationing feed, mending what could be mended, keeping his father's spirit calm with old hymns and stories from better days. Sometimes he wondered if anyone else still remembered why this land mattered. The neighbors respected him, in their own quiet way, offering the occasional hand or nod of acknowledgement. But even they had begun to lean into the future, modernizing, outsourcing, adapting. Elijah had no such luxury. He was called old-fashioned now, a man out of step with time, refusing to lease out his fields or digitize his operations. But for Elijah, the farm was not a business venture. It was the last remnant of something sacred, and every offer to buy it felt like a slap against the memory of those who had built it with nothing but strength and hope. That evening, with the sun bleeding red into the horizon, Elijah sat on the porch beside his father. The old man had been restless all day, muttering fragments of the past under his breath. Names Elijah didn't recognize, places he hadn't been. As the sky dimmed, his father grew quiet, eyes flickering with a strange awareness. Then, barely audible, he whispered something that stopped Elijah cold. "They're trying to steal our roots, Eli, just like before." The words cut through the dusk like a blade. Elijah turned to him, but the old man had already drifted back into silence, staring out at the fields with vacant eyes. Still, the weight of that warning hung heavy. Elijah stood, his gaze traveling across the land. The cornstalks swayed weakly in the breeze, as though bowing under pressure. He could feel it too, the world pressing in, trying to reclaim what they had fought so hard to hold. His fists clenched at his sides, the fading light casting long shadows across his face. The farm might be failing by every measurable standard, profit, output, market relevance, but it was more than dirt and labor. It was story, memory, blood. Letting it go would mean giving up the part of himself still anchored in something pure. No bank manager or corporate buyer could ever understand that. As the stars blinked awake above, Elijah whispered a vow, not out loud, but within, where it counted most. He would hold the line, not just for his father, not just for legacy, but for the quiet, unspoken truth that some things were not meant to be sold. And in that fading moment, surrounded by silence and stubborn soil, he felt the land answer back. The storm came in with the kind of sudden ferocity Elijah Rowe had learned to read in the winds, but not always to outrun. By the time he pulled out of the feed store 20 miles from his property, the clouds had gathered into bruised fists, low and boiling, trailing veins of lightning like warning signs written across the sky. Rain slapped the windshield with growing urgency as he navigated the back roads home, the truck bed loaded with seed bags, fencing wire, and engine oil he probably couldn't afford, but would somehow stretch into usefulness. The roads, unpaved and neglected, turned slick beneath the weight of the storm, and each bend felt tighter than the last, visibility cut to a smear of watery black. His eyes stung from strain, shoulders tense from hours behind the wheel and years behind burdens. It was near the southern boundary of his land, on a narrow turn flanked by trees and the drop of an old embankment, when something flickered in his periphery. At first it looked like nothing, a branch maybe, or the shadow of movement, but instinct pulled his foot off the gas. He backed up slowly, tires hissing against the drenched clay. That's when he saw it. A vehicle sat twisted at the bottom of the slope, its front end wedged into the underbrush, steam hissing from beneath the crumpled hood. The storm made it ghostly, shrouded in mist and half hidden by branches, but it was there, metal against earth, broken, bleeding light. Elijah sat still for a long moment, hands resting on the steering wheel, rain drumming on the roof like impatient fingers. Part of him wanted to keep driving, not because he was afraid he'd faced worse than storm-wrecked cars, but because he was tired. The kind of tired that didn't come from lack of sleep, but from years of pressing on under a weight no one seemed to notice he carried. But something deeper overruled his exhaustion. A thread of duty, maybe, or something his grandfather had once said about how a man doesn't get to choose when he's needed. He sighed, muttered under his breath, then grabbed the tire iron from behind the seat. The climb down was steep and slick. Mud swallowed his boots and tree limbs slapped at his face, but he kept going until he reached the driver's side. The windshield had caved in slightly, fractured like a spiderweb of violence. The driver was slumped across the console, motionless, one hand twisted unnaturally against the dash. Elijah tapped the window once, then twice harder. No movement. Rain poured down in sheets now, blurring edges and stealing warmth. Without hesitation, Elijah drove the iron into the side window, glass shattering with a crack that disappeared into the thunder. He reached in, careful and deliberate, checking for a pulse. It was there, shallow but present. Blood streaked the man's temple and jaw, and his clothes, what looked like an expensive suit, were torn and soaked. No wallet, no phone, just a silver cufflink glinting like an accusation in the flicker of lightning. Elijah worked quickly, easing the man free of the seatbelt and hoisting his weight awkwardly onto his shoulder. The mud fought every step back up the slope, dragging at his legs, but Elijah gritted his teeth and pushed on, one slow step after another. Rain washed the blood in thin rivers down his arm, but he didn't stop. He laid the man gently across the passenger seat of his truck, covering him with a tarp from the back. The man's skin was pale and clammy, mouth slightly parted, breath shallow and uneven. Elijah glanced down the road, empty, just rain, fog, and the muffled roar of distant thunder. He climbed in, started the engine, and turned toward home. The farmhouse was dim and quiet when they arrived. Elijah parked close to the side porch and carried the stranger inside, placing him carefully on the worn couch in the front room. He grabbed towels, a flashlight, and his old first aid kit, cleaning what he could while trying to keep the blood from soaking too deep into the fabric. The man stirred once, flinching slightly at Elijah's touch, but never opened his eyes. Elijah called the local clinic just after midnight, cradling the phone against his shoulder while pressing gauze against the stranger's temple. The nurse on the line was slow to answer, her voice groggy and indifferent until Elijah mentioned the man was white and looked like he might be somebody important. Her tone shifted instantly. She asked a flurry of questions he couldn't answer. Name, insurance, what hospital he was supposed to be at. Elijah said there was no ID, no phone, no signal out here anyway. The nurse hesitated, said they were short-staffed, promised to see what could be done. Then the line went dead with a soft click. Elijah stood in the quiet that followed, jaw tight. He pulled a blanket over the man and sat nearby, staring at the storm through the window. His father stirred in the next room but didn't call out. The night dragged on slow and uneasy. Around 3 a.m, the man shifted again, eyelids fluttering. Elijah leaned forward, ready to offer water or words, but the man only murmured, soft and fractured, like a needle skipping on a broken record. Something about a meeting, a board vote, and then, barely audible, "They tried to kill me." Elijah blinked, unsure if he'd heard correctly. Probably nothing, just fevered nonsense from a bruised head. Still, the words lingered like the scent of ozone after lightning. He watched the man for a while longer before finally rising to check the locks. The storm had passed, leaving behind a silence that felt unnatural. No wind, no frogs, just the creak of the old house settling around its secrets. At dawn, the light came in slow and gray, filtering through the wet lace of trees. Elijah stepped onto the porch, sipping lukewarm coffee, his body sore from the night's exertion. The field stretched wide before him, soaked and sleeping. He scanned the horizon out of habit, and that's when he saw it. A black SUV parked at the far edge of the property line, just beyond the fence. It didn't move, just sat there, engine idling faintly in the quiet. Elijah didn't raise a hand or walk toward it. He didn't need to. Whoever they weren't lost. They were watching. He turned back toward the house, his face unreadable. Behind him, the truck still dripped stormwater onto the gravel. Inside, the injured man remained unconscious, his breathing ragged and shallow against the hush of the waking farm. Elijah closed the door behind him without a sound. Nathaniel sat in the corner of Elijah's old barn, weak but alert, his eyes scanning the walls lined with rusted tools and feed sacks. In the quiet hum of early morning, Elijah brought out his father's ham radio, something he hadn't touched in years. The knobs were stiff, dust coating the dials like ash, but the signal caught with a low crackle. Nathaniel leaned in, his voice strained but firm as he transmitted a series of numbers, coordinates, and a call sign known only to a select few. Elijah stood silently beside him, the gravity of the moment settling in his chest like stone. Hours later, just as the sun broke above the tree line, the first thump of helicopter blades split the dawn. They weren't police. They weren't government. They came swift and precise, black suits stepping onto soil damp with morning dew, not with questions, but with purpose. Nathaniel's people had arrived. It unraveled quickly after that. The SUV that had stalked the fields was found abandoned by the creek, its tires slashed, contents burned. The men who had come after Nathaniel weren't lawmen. They were private contractors, mercenaries funded by men who once called themselves Nathaniel's partners. He hadn't exaggerated. He had been hunted, and Elijah's intervention hadn't just saved a life, it had intercepted a takeover. There was a fortune buried in that failed vote, in that missed meeting, in the blood they were willing to spill to keep Nathaniel silent. And somehow, Elijah's quiet act of compassion had drawn a line in the dirt they dared not cross. News spread faster than Elijah could contain it. A local station caught wind, then a national outlet. Reporters came sniffing up the gravel drive, their vans kicking dust into the wind as they offered microphones and flattery. Elijah refused them all. He never stepped onto their sets or let them into his home. When asked why he stayed silent, he only offered a shrug. He hadn't done it for attention. He'd done it because a man had been bleeding and alone, and the land had put Elijah there for a reason. Nathaniel came back, not with guards or lawyers this time, but with gratitude heavy in his hands. He stood beside Elijah in the field and offered him a blank check, eyes open, voice humble. Elijah turned it down without hesitation. Money wasn't what had driven him to the embankment that night. But Nathaniel didn't retreat. He moved quietly, respectfully. The foreclosure letters stopped. New equipment arrived, tractors that started on the first turn, irrigation systems that didn't groan in protest. A trust was created, buried deep in legal protection, carrying Elijah's name. Nathaniel never asked for recognition. He just wanted to ensure the land would never be taken from Elijah's family, not in his lifetime or any that followed. It was later, when the field was silent and the house warm again, that Elijah's father spoke. Days had passed with his memory dimmed, but for a brief moment, clarity returned. He looked at Nathaniel, eyes narrowing, something old and knowing flickering across his face. With a raspy breath, he uttered a single sentence. "Told you. The land always knows who it calls." Then he drifted back, the moment gone like fog lifting from the earth. And so the field remained. No fences were raised, no monuments carved. Elijah woke before the light as always, and walked the length of his soil. He paused near the barn, the roof now whole, the boards no longer weeping. He dropped to one knee, fingers sinking into the dirt, feeling the weight of years, the pull of something deeper than blood. Around him, the crops had returned. No banners waved, no audience watched. Just one man, grounded in silence, standing where his roots had always known to grow,